On the night of April 21, 2016, the small, quiet town of Piketon, Ohio, was shattered by a crime so horrific, it would become known as the deadliest family massacre in Ohio's history. 8 members of the Roden family, ranging from a 16-year-old girl to her parents, were brutally executed in their homes, leaving no trace of a motive, at least, not at first. As law enforcement scrambled to make sense of this unimaginable tragedy, the investigation soon uncovered a shocking truth. A bitter custody dispute, fueled by years of hidden tensions, had led to a planned massacre. The perpetrators? The Wagner family, Jake Wagner, his father Billy Wagner, his mother Angela Wagner, and his brother George Wagner IV. But what drove this seemingly normal family to commit such a gruesome act? What twisted set of circumstances led them to hunt down and murder an entire family in cold blood? And what did the surviving children witness that night, left behind to carry the weight of the darkest chapter in Pike County's history? This is the true story of the Pike County Massacre, where betrayal, revenge, and a deadly obsession collide, leaving behind a broken community and a tale of horror that still haunts Ohio today. The Roden family had lived in the rural hills of Pike County, Ohio, for generations. Known for their hard-working nature, they were deeply rooted in the community. The family was made up of strong, independent people, fathers, mothers, and children who all worked together to make a living from the land. At the center of this close-knit group was 16-year-old Hannah Mae Roden. A devoted young mother, Hannah had 2 children, including a 3-year-old daughter she shared with her former boyfriend, Jake Wagner. Hannah's parents, Christopher and Dana Roden, had raised a family that seemed like any other in the quiet town. They were respected, friendly, and lived the kind of life many people in Pike County aspired to. But, while the outside world saw a peaceful and ordinary family, tensions were quietly simmering within the Rodens. Hannah's relationship with Jake Wagner had soured over the years. They had an on-again, off-again romance that had ended in a bitter breakup. Their daughter, a bright young child, became the center of an escalating custody battle. The young mother sought full custody, something Jake Wagner couldn't accept. The custody battle was not just a legal matter, it became a bitter, personal conflict, one that would spiral out of control and set the stage for unimaginable violence. Hannah and her family, unaware of the dark turn their lives were about to take, carried on with their daily routines. Little did they know, the Wagner family, who had once been close to them, were plotting something far more destructive. Behind closed doors, the Wagners were making plans that would soon send shockwaves through Pike County. The Rodens had no way of knowing that this family dispute would soon lead to one of the most brutal massacres Ohio had ever seen. The Wagners weren't just acquaintances of the Rodens. They were deeply embedded in their lives. Jake Wagner, the eldest son of Billy and Angela Wagner, had been in a long-term relationship with Hannah Mae Roden. Together, they had a young daughter, just 3 years old. But that relationship had unraveled, and with it, a bitter custody dispute that would soon spiral into something far more deadly. Jake had lost custody of their daughter, and that loss consumed him. The custody battle wasn't just a legal issue, it became an obsession. He wanted his daughter back, and he believed the Rodens, particularly Hannah, were standing in his way. This wasn't just a fight over visitation rights. It was a fight to reclaim what he thought was rightfully his. Billy and Angela Wagner, Jake's parents, were not passive observers of this conflict. They became deeply involved, even more so than most grandparents would. They shared Jake's belief that the Rodens were obstructing their family, and they were willing to go to any lengths to help him regain custody of his daughter. To them, this wasn't just a personal matter, it was a matter of family loyalty. Billy Wagner, a man with a history of violent behavior, was the driving force behind the Wagners' actions. With a criminal past, he had the experience and the cold pragmatism needed to execute a plan like this. Angela, equally resolute, was right alongside him, encouraging the mission. Together, they plotted the perfect way to eliminate the Rodens and erase any obstacle standing between Jake and his daughter. Months of meticulous planning followed. The Wagners studied the Roden family's daily routines, noting when they were most vulnerable. They decided to strike when they knew the Rodens would be at their most unprepared, at home, sleeping, in their most personal spaces. The Wagner family believed they were justified. In their eyes, the Rodens weren't just a family they disagreed with, they were a threat to the future of their son and granddaughter. And, so, the Wagners began their preparations. They knew what they were about to do was unforgivable, but they were certain it was the only way to restore control to their family. Behind the peaceful facade of the Roden family's life, a deadly plan was being meticulously crafted by the Wagner family. What began as a bitter custody battle over 3-year-old Sophia Roden slowly twisted into something far darker, something Jake Wagner would soon believe was his only option. Jake, the ex-boyfriend of Hannah Roden, had been deeply involved in his daughter's life. But with Hannah fighting for full custody, Jake was losing access, and his frustration was mounting. What started as a dispute over visitation rights morphed into a violent obsession, one that would eventually consume the entire Wagner family. The custody battle was no longer just a legal issue, it was personal. Hannah's attempts to protect her daughter ignited a fire in Jake, who was determined to reclaim control. But Jake wasn't alone in this. His family, particularly his parents, Billy and Angela Wagner, stood by him, and together, they devised a chilling plan. The Wagners would destroy the Roden family, wiping them out once and for all. For months, the Wagner family had been quietly watching the Rodens. They knew the family's routines, the times they'd be home, and the most vulnerable moments in their lives. Jake and his parents were patient, knowing that the perfect moment to strike would come. Their plan wasn't rushed. They knew they had only one shot at it, and it had to be executed flawlessly. The plan was deceptively simple: eliminate the Roden family with cold, ruthless precision. 4 homes, 8 victims, all executed in one night. Each Wagner family member would play their part. Billy Wagner, the father, providing logistical support, Jake Wagner, the ex-boyfriend, taking charge of the killings, and George Wagner IV, his brother, helping execute the murders swiftly. They studied every detail. They knew when the Rodens would be asleep, when the homes would be dark and empty of witnesses. No one could survive. The Wagners had already made sure of that. In their twisted minds, this was the only solution. One that would end the custody battle and remove any obstacle from Jake's path. But even as they prepared, they didn't realize the magnitude of what they were about to do. They couldn't have known that once the blood was spilled, there would be no turning back. Their plan would be far more than a solution, it would mark the beginning of their own undoing. As the Wagners set their sights on April 21, 2016, they believed they had everything under control. But in their relentless pursuit of revenge, they were blind to one crucial detail: someone would survive. Someone would break the silence. And when they did, the investigation that followed would be as shocking as the crime itself. The early hours of April 22, 2016, would mark a devastating chapter in the history of Pike County. As most of the small town slept, the Roden family was about to experience an unspeakable horror. The Wagner family, led by Jake Wagner, had spent months preparing for this moment. Their plan was methodical, deliberate, and horrifying. In the dead of night, they moved quietly from house to house. The first target, the home of 40-year-old Christopher Roden Sr., his ex-wife, and their children. Jake Wagner, armed with a rifle, crept into the house where Christopher and his son, Clarence, slept. Without hesitation, they were shot execution-style in their beds. It was swift. There was no sign of struggle, no warning. Just cold, calculated violence. Next, the Wagners moved to the nearby homes of 2 more Roden family members, each home in close proximity. In the darkness, they executed their plan with chilling precision. 38-year-old Dana Roden and her 16-year-old daughter, Hannah Mae Roden, were killed in a similar fashion. Dana's 20-year-old fiancée, Hannah Gilley, who had recently been staying with the family, was also shot and left lifeless on the floor. As the killers made their way to the last house, they encountered a different scene. 19-year-old Jake Wagner's ex-girlfriend, Hannah Roden, lay in bed with her 3 children. The youngest child was an infant, just a few months old. Jake's motive had always been about revenge, fueled by his desire for full custody of his daughter, who had been living with Hannah. But as Jake entered the house, his rage only grew. The execution was swift, brutal, and carried out without mercy. The killings were methodical, each shot aimed to end a life in seconds, without a chance for survival. Yet, amidst the carnage, there was something unexplainable. 3 children, 2 of them infants, were left untouched. They had been hidden beneath their mothers' bodies, spared from the chaos of the massacre. In total, 8 lives were claimed in that single night, an entire family wiped out in an act of calculated vengeance. As quickly as it had begun, the Wagners retreated into the darkness, leaving the bodies behind in the quiet town. The town of Piketon awoke the next morning to the devastating news. The brutality of the murders shocked law enforcement, but they were left with little to go on. No witnesses. No obvious motive. Only the horror of a family annihilated, and the haunting question, who could do such a thing? The massacre was carefully planned, the killers leaving behind no traces of their identity. The Rodens had no enemies, not of this magnitude. No one had ever expected something so horrific to happen in their small, rural community. But as the investigation began, it would soon become clear that this wasn't just a random act of violence, it was the result of deep-seated anger, a custody dispute, and the cold revenge of a family who'd let their darkest instincts take over. As the sun rose on April 22, 2016, the peaceful town of Piketon was forever changed. The police were called to a chilling crime scene, 4 homes, scattered across rural Union Hill Road, each one bearing the same gruesome imprint, execution-style killings, with no sign of struggle. The victims, 8 members of the Roden family, were found dead in their beds, in their cars, and in one case, even in a camper. At first, there were no obvious suspects. The Rodens were well-known, hard-working people in the community, with no known enemies. Investigators were left to piece together a mystery that didn't make sense. Who could commit such a horrific crime in a town where everyone knew each other? And why? For weeks, the case seemed to be at a standstill. The Pike County Sheriff's Department, along with state authorities, found no leads. No witnesses came forward. No fingerprints, no DNA, no surveillance footage. Just a trail of blood and unanswered questions. As the investigation stretched into its 2nd month, the authorities began to review everything they had, old case files, witness testimonies, even the social circles the victims interacted with. It was then that a key detail started to emerge, one name that kept appearing in various conversations: Jake Wagner. Jake Wagner, Hannah Roden's ex-boyfriend and the father of her young daughter, was now under suspicion. His strained relationship with Hannah, once just part of a complicated custody battle, now seemed to hold greater significance. Authorities soon learned that Jake had been embroiled in a bitter custody dispute over their daughter, a situation made even more tense by Hannah's decision to file a restraining order against him just weeks before the murders. With this new focus on Jake Wagner, investigators began to look deeper into his ties to the Roden family. They found that Jake's family, the Wagners, had been involved in the lives of the Rodens for years, though they had always appeared to be on the periphery. Could it be that this seemingly normal, small-town family had harbored a deadly secret? As investigators reviewed phone records, text messages, and social media profiles, the connections between the Wagners and the Rodens began to paint a chilling picture. Hannah's breakup with Jake had not only strained their relationship but had also ignited a series of escalating tensions. At this point, it was clear, the massacre was no random act of violence. It had been planned, meticulously, with a personal motive behind it. But why go to such extreme lengths? What could have pushed the Wagner family to commit such an unimaginable crime? The pieces were slowly falling into place, but the full truth remained just out of reach. What investigators would soon learn was that the Wagner family was not just a peripheral part of the Rodens' lives, they were at the very center of the storm. For months, investigators struggled to make sense of the Pike County massacre. With no witnesses and little evidence to go on, it seemed like the case was slipping further into the abyss. The victims, 8 members of the Roden family, had been executed in cold blood, but there was no immediate clue to their killer's identity. As weeks turned into months, the small town of Piketon was left to wrestle with unanswered questions. But then, something critical emerged. The Wagner family. At first, they seemed an unlikely suspect. The Wagners, Billy, Angela, and their 2 sons, Jake and George IV, had only a passing connection to the Rodens. Jake Wagner had been in a relationship with Hannah Roden, one of the victims, and they had a daughter together, but their custody battle had been relatively low-key. Yet, as investigators began to dig deeper, they uncovered a disturbing pattern. Jake Wagner had been obsessively fighting for full custody of their daughter. The battle had turned ugly, with Hannah Roden seeking to limit Jake's access to their child. Family court documents revealed the depth of the conflict, but what was most unsettling was the timing. The massacre occurred just months after Jake's final, unsuccessful attempt to gain full custody. Was this a desperate, vengeful act of violence? The breakthrough came when investigators started to look at the Wagners' movements leading up to the murders. Surveillance footage from nearby areas revealed vehicles, connected to the Wagner family, near the Roden homes just days before the massacre. The Wagners had been watching. They had been studying the routines of the Roden family, mapping out when they would be the most vulnerable. The case began to take shape when police discovered an important clue. Billy Wagner, Jake's father, was linked to a high-powered rifle that had been used in the killings. This was the moment that connected the Wagner family to the massacre in a way no one had expected. Suddenly, the Wagners weren't just distant figures, they were prime suspects, and the investigation was on the cusp of breaking wide open. Nearly 2 years after the massacre, the investigation had reached a dead end. The community was haunted by unanswered questions, and the Wagner family remained under a cloud of suspicion. But in November 2018, the truth began to unravel in the most shocking of ways. A breakthrough came when investigators discovered a series of unsettling details that tied the Wagner family to the murders. Jake Wagner, the ex-boyfriend of Hannah Roden and the father of her child, was found to have meticulously planned the killings, his motives driven by an escalating custody battle over their daughter. But he wasn't alone. It wasn't just Jake. It was his father, Billy Wagner, his mother, Angela Wagner, and his brother, George Wagner IV, who were all implicated. A tight-knit, family-oriented conspiracy, the Wagners had devised the massacre to eliminate anyone who stood in the way of Jake's access to his daughter. Jake Wagner was arrested first, and his arrest sent shockwaves through the tight-knit rural community of Pike County. On January 2020, Jake Wagner entered a plea deal, admitting to all 8 counts of aggravated murder. In exchange, he would avoid the death penalty, receiving a life sentence with the possibility of parole after 32 years. His confession was chilling, revealing just how far he and his family had gone to carry out their plot. He described the cold, calculated manner in which they executed the Roden family, leaving little room for empathy or remorse. As the Wagner family faced charges, the courtroom drama unfolded. Angela Wagner, Jake's mother, who had been charged with conspiracy to commit aggravated murder, pleaded guilty in 2021. Her plea deal resulted in a 30-year sentence, ensuring that she would spend the rest of her life behind bars for her role in orchestrating the massacre. She had helped in the planning and even assisted in acquiring the weapons used in the killings. But it was George Wagner IV, the youngest of the Wagners, who would face the most intense trial. His defense team argued that George was just following orders, a mere bystander caught up in the family's twisted plot. But the prosecution painted a much darker picture. They argued that George had played an active role in the slaughter, driving the vehicle that transported the family to the Roden homes. In 2022, after a lengthy trial, George Wagner IV was convicted on all 8 counts of aggravated murder. The jury found no remorse in him, and he was sentenced to 8 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, plus 121 additional years for his involvement in the other charges. As the final member of the Wagner family, Billy Wagner, awaited trial, the court proceedings became a media frenzy. His defense team argued that the extensive media coverage of the case had poisoned the potential jury pool, pushing for a change of venue. Billy Wagner's trial has been repeatedly delayed, with a new date set for early 2025, but it was clear that his fate was all but sealed. In a case already marked by its chilling brutality, Billy's role as the patriarch, who allegedly had a hand in the killings, would soon be brought to light. For the families of the Rodin victims, justice felt both distant and fleeting. While the Wagners were being sentenced for their crimes, the scars left by the massacre ran deep. Pike County would never be the same, and the legal drama was far from over. In 2022, after years of investigation and the conviction of his family members, the final piece of the puzzle would be placed in the courtroom. The focus now turned to George Wagner IV, the youngest of the Wagner family, and the last to stand trial for the massacre that devastated Pike County. The trial was set to be the most high-profile case in the area for years. It was a moment of reckoning, a chance for justice to be served for the Rodin family and for those who had survived that horrific night. George Wagner IV, like his parents and brother, was accused of playing a central role in the murders of 8 members of the Rodin family, and his trial would determine if he would face the full weight of Ohio's justice system. George had already been arrested alongside his family, but unlike Jake and Angela Wagner, who had entered guilty pleas in exchange for reduced sentences, George decided to stand trial. His defense team insisted that he was merely a pawn in his family's criminal plan, coerced and manipulated by his father, Billy Wagner, and older brother, Jake. They argued George had been influenced by his family's obsessive need to seek revenge in a bitter custody battle over his niece, which had escalated into an unimaginable act of violence. But the prosecution painted a very different picture. The evidence against George was damning, and the jury was presented with a chilling account of his involvement in the massacre. Testimony from Jake Wagner, who had already confessed and agreed to testify against his family, laid bare the extent of George's role. Jake described how the Wagner family meticulously planned the execution-style killings and how George was directly involved in carrying out the murders, methodically shooting the victims in their homes, leaving no survivors. The prosecution also presented key physical evidence that tied George to the crime scenes. Cell phone records placed him near the Rodin homes on the night of the killings, and surveillance footage from nearby cameras showed George in a vehicle driven by his brother Jake, clearly involved in the night's deadly mission. There was no question that George Wagner IV had been an active participant in the massacre. As the trial went on, the emotional weight of the case became more apparent. The survivors of the Rodin family, especially the 3 young children who had survived the massacre, sat through the proceedings, bearing witness to the final chapter of their traumatic ordeal. Their presence in the courtroom was a stark reminder of the lasting impact this tragedy would have on them for the rest of their lives. The defense tried to shift the blame onto Billy Wagner and Jake Wagner, arguing that George was just following orders from his father and brother. But despite their efforts, the jury was not swayed. The evidence was clear, and the emotional toll on the victims' families could not be ignored. After deliberations, the jury returned with a verdict, guilty on all 8 counts of aggravated murder. George Wagner IV was sentenced to 8 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 121 years for related crimes, ensuring he would never see the light of day again. For the survivors and the community of Pike County, the verdict was bittersweet. While there was relief that the man responsible for so many lives lost was finally held accountable, the scars of the massacre would never fully heal. Justice had been served, but the damage inflicted on the Rodin family and the entire town would be felt for generations. The trial of George Wagner IV marked the end of a long and painful journey, but it did little to erase the horror of what had happened in Pike County. The wounds may have begun to close, but the shadows of that night would continue to haunt the families forever. In the days that followed the massacre, the town of Pike County was left reeling from the unimaginable violence that had torn through the Rodin family. As investigators combed through the crime scenes, one haunting detail emerged. The survival of 3 children. 2 infants and a toddler, who had been hidden by their mothers during the attack, were left untouched by the bloodshed. The youngest of the survivors, only days old, was found wrapped in blankets, oblivious to the horror around them. The 2 other children, just toddlers at the time, were discovered cowering in their homes, their tiny minds struggling to comprehend what had just happened. Their families were gone. Their safety, shattered. Immediately placed into protective custody, the survivors were whisked away from the carnage, but no amount of distance could shield them from the psychological toll. These children, too young to fully understand what they had witnessed, would bear the weight of their loss in ways that would unfold over the coming years. They were moved to live with relatives, but their future remained uncertain. The tragedy they had survived would follow them for the rest of their lives. As time passed, the community began to heal, but for these 3 children, healing seemed an impossible feat. They were too young to understand the full scope of the nightmare they'd lived through, but as they grew older, they would inevitably confront the haunting memories of that night, memories that would never fade, no matter how far they were from the homes they once knew. The surviving children were a painful reminder of the human cost of the violence that had gripped Pike County. Their existence became a symbol of innocence lost and lives forever changed by a family's twisted thirst for revenge. As they grew up, they would likely face more questions than answers, questions no child should ever have to ask. Years have passed since the bloodshed in Pike County, but the scars left by the massacre still linger. 8 innocent lives were stolen in the dead of night, forever altering the course of the Roden family and the town of Piketon. The brutal, execution-style killings shattered a community that had once felt safe and secure, where neighbors knew each other by name and families lived side by side, unaware of the dark forces at play. Justice, though slow, has finally been served. Jake Wagner, the man at the center of this horrific plan, pleaded guilty to all 8 murders in exchange for a life sentence. His parents, Billy and Angela Wagner, have been sentenced as well, Billy still facing his day in court. George Wagner IV, the youngest of the Wagners, was convicted of his role in the killings and handed consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. For those who survived, particularly the 3 young children left behind, the path to healing remains long and uncertain, their futures forever marked by the violence they witnessed. While the Wagner family's conviction brings some sense of justice, it can never erase the horror of what happened that night. The ripple effects of this massacre echo through the generations, reminding us how far revenge and obsession can drive a person to destroy not only their own lives but the lives of those closest to them. The pain for the surviving family members of the Rodens, and the community at large, is a heavy burden that will likely never lift. As we reflect on the unimaginable loss of 8 lives, one question remains: what drove a family, bound by blood and history, to commit such an atrocity? And what can we learn from this tragedy to prevent future horrors born from the darkest corners of the human heart? Now that you've heard the chilling details of this tragedy, we want to know your thoughts. What do you think pushed the Wagner family to commit such an unimaginable crime? Was it a deep-rooted vendetta, or something far darker hidden beneath the surface? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video if you found the story gripping. If you want to stay updated on more true crime stories that uncover the darkest secrets, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon for future videos. This is a story that left scars on a community, and we'll continue to uncover the mysteries behind it, together.